Hello and welcome back to my stitchery. If you don't know me, then I am Shiardia Garapi, but you guys can call me Shishi. Today on Sewing Tools That Work, we're going to explore pins. And this one's going to be super short because I only have 3 kinds. See you in a minute. All right. So today it's going to be super easy because there's only 3 pins that I use on a regular basis. I use a long Quilters pin, which is hard to see, but has this little yellow tip, and I'll show you these in a minute. I have my glass head pin, which looks very similar, but is tipped with a little glass bead instead of plastic. And these teeny tiny little pins. That's it. That's all I use. I use all of these pins in different ways because as long as they're sharp, straight, and able to go through the material I'm looking at, I don't care. The alternative to these is clips. And now most people use Wonder clips. I, however, use the cheaper version, binder clips. I keep them in a nice little tin like this. And I have little bitty ones and I have bigger ones, although I am starting to run out of these bigger clips because I use them for a lot of different things. So why do I use binder clips and not Wonder clips? 2 reasons. 1, they're way cheaper. You can get binder clips at the dollar store, at Staples, at Walmart. Pretty much anywhere that sells stationery supplies will carry binder clips. Binder clips work on leather, they work on quilted padding, they work on paper, they work everywhere, and they're not as damageable as plastic clips. Plastic clips, in my experience, have a tendency to break. So while Wonder clips are wonderful, they're also easier to break and damage. They're also harder to feel when I'm going through my piles and trying to make sure which pieces go with what. So if they slip off, I really don't know what's going on. Binder clips hold, and because their insides are smooth, they're smooth aluminum metal, they don't tend to pinch or cut anything that I use. I don't use them on leather. Usually whenever I do leather, I have a very specific project in mind and I use only a couple of different tools for it, and I generally sew it by hand. Leather's tricky. When it comes to vinyl, the binder clips works just fine. With pins, they would leave marks in my vinyl and they're not as easy. Now, the second reason I use binder clips instead of Wonder clips is because they're cheap. I know that's my first reason and my second reason, but really they're cheap. So when they get damaged or when they aren't the right kind, I don't feel bad for spending a couple of extra dollars to go get some more. I don't mind if I run out of binder clips because they are so easily used all over my sewing room, in all different kinds of my projects, even in my crafts. So they're much easier. Back to pins. Now, the 3 pins that I showed you are my everydays, but how I use them is not always every day. I use these long Quilters pins for almost all of my sewing projects. I pin multiple layers of fabric together. I also use them generally to put things on my mannequins and other things. They're a lot longer and easier to find, and because they're all a consistent color of yellow, I find that they're easier to find when I'm trying to lay a pattern. Glass head pins and not plastic head pins are kind of controversial. So with this one is a glass head pin. The difference being a tiny piece of glass that is tipping the end of my pin instead of plastic. The reason I use these is because they can be heated. So you can use them with your iron and not have to remove your pin or end up with melted plastic all over your project. Really, I don't like melted plastic on the best of days, so I do try to avoid it. So glass head pins are a little easier. They're not as cheap as regular plastic head pins, and sometimes they can break. So the pin head, which is this metal part here, this pin has a head that's under here, which is just a teeny tiny little piece of metal that caps the top of the pin. And it looks just like these pins do. Let's get it to focus. So the top of my pin there is just a little bit flatter, and this part is sharp. Ouch! And with glass head pins, that little metal piece is covered with a little globule of glass. Problem is that glass shatters, so you have to be careful when you drop your pins onto a table. You also have to be careful if you get them caught in your sewing machine, because the needle hitting your pin jolts the pin and can sometimes make it lose or loosen the tip of the pin. So, like normal, don't sew over your pins. I have to say that if you are going to sew over your pins, be very careful not to sew over them with the point towards your machine or towards you, because they fly. Put them in sideways so that when you're running over your foot this way, it just hits the pin and then bounces into the fabric. Usually that stops it from breaking. You do have to change your needle and of course remove your pin after, but better than the flying pins of doom. With the little short metal pins, which are generally called dressmaker pins, I use those to pin up things on my walls more often than not. They go into foam core quite easily and hold paper and other weights very, very easily. I can also use them for little projects and to hold corners and edges because they're very sharp. Dressmaker pins tend to have a sharper end, and that means that they can go through slick fabrics, they can go through satins, they can go through silks and not leave as many pin holes and etc. The bigger the pin, the bigger the hole. So the smaller the pin, smaller the hole. And the smaller the pointy tip, the smaller the hole. So I generally use them for anything that's small, delicate, or is strange. So a lot of weird materials, silky, strange materials, some of the weird knits that I get that don't have very good fabric. These terrible knits right here with this very see-through weave where you can basically see through them. Okay, these are very difficult to pin and need a lot of pins. So since I don't like to invest in more glass head pins than I need, using little dressmaker pins is easier, especially because they tend to come in packs of 2000s and such, which makes them easier for me to keep, cheaper, and to be fair, if I lose them, I don't feel so bad. When I do lose my Quilters pins or my glass head pins, I do kind of get a little sad. There is variations to all of these types of pins. So some of those pins can have like a flat head instead of this bulbous top. And those are generally called flathead pins. And they're very good for marking things. They're also very good for stacks of fabric because you poke them all the way through and you're able to tell which fabric is being used for what. So if you're doing a quilt and you have a bunch of stacks of squares that are all the same size, but you need to keep each of the colors separate or each of the sequences or each of the blocks separate, you have a variation of pins that you can very easily just stick through them and you know which ones go where and you never get them mixed up. That's pretty much it. Pins are super easy. You don't need fancy ones. You don't need complicated ones. You don't even need to have the right ones. You can use any kind of pin, dull, wiggly, sharp. A lot of difference is usually your fabric, not your pin. One note about Crookedy pins. So a lot of my pins are not straight. They are very dented, twisted, broken, having been sewn over or flexed in fabric often. I can use these pins because I've had a lot of practice at moving my pins and putting them in a way that creates a flat edge even if my pin is crooked. That's not easy. It is a skill that you have to learn, and it is not something anyone can really teach you. You have to figure it out for yourself. What I do say is that if you have broken pins, put them in a separate container or a separate pin cushion. And keep those for less important projects or for practice. They also make very good crafting things, so if you want to make that cute super pincushion hat that everybody finds so popular, the best bet, take your old pins, the broken ones and twisted ones, take the tip off with a wire clipper, and then just glue them into where you want. Works beautifully. Looks like a pin, sharpish like a pin, and no pins in your head. Very important substance. So that's it on pins. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you are able to learn something from this, and I hope that your wild imagination continues. Have a wonderful day, guys, and I'll see you next time.